Thank you, Victor, for the introduction. Actually, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. Just before we start, I'll mention this. What I will present today is actually the result of my work when I was at the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg together with Victor. And yeah, as Victor said, we're going to move a bit north. So we're going to leave the Amazon. We're going to go to the Boreal forest and try to understand something in terms of multistability, as it has been mentioned already by Stefan, of the forest cover. Few words about why this is important. The answer to this question depends essentially on your background and on what you're studying. But when it comes to climate of the Boreal forest, the reason is threefold. One is because of the effect of the forest on the climate cycle and on the carbon cycle. So the Boreal forest is not only affected by climate and environmental conditions, but is also affecting it. Other than carbon, it does it also with the evapotranspiration in the hydrological cycle, as Stefan told us before lunch. And then the last part is actually concerned about the albedo of the forest compared to the land surrounding it. In fact, both in summer and in winter, the Boreal forest is darker. It has lower albedo than the shrubs or the bare lands. And this is especially true in winter when the phenomenon known as snow masking happens. This is what we see in this, I think, beautiful picture, where you have the trees, especially the conifers, piercing through the snow and actually masking the snow beneath them. So you have this extreme contrast between where you have just snow, pure white, reflecting radiation back to the atmosphere and then to space, and where you have the trees trapping this radiation. Now, all of this, of course, depends on the structure and on the extent of the forest. And this has been changing, as we know, and because of climate change, and this can change sometimes linearly, sometimes non-linearly. And this is when things get interesting, when you can have these ecosystems, sometimes big ecosystems, that can reside in different stable states, in alternative configurations, under more or less the same environmental conditions. And of course, if you push a little bit the system with a disturbance, it can transition to a completely different state. An example of this, a very important example of this, when it comes to forest, is what happened to the Sahara 5,000–6,000 years ago, more or less, where we had a transition from a green and verdant forest to what is today the largest warm desert. Actually, if you want to know more about this, we have one of the leading experts on the topic in the room today, Martin Clausen. And this is what could potentially happen also for the Boreal forest or for any forest. It doesn't have necessarily to go back to desert, but it could be that you have transitions to phenologically different states of the forest or of the tree cover. Now, the important thing to remember about this is that these ecosystems, they can reside in different configurations, in different stable states under the same conditions, and they can transition between them following hysteresis pathways. I will get into the topic for the Boreal forest essentially in 3 steps. The first one is related to observing the existence of alternative stable states. We're going to do so using global data sets, mostly from remote sensing and Earth observation. The second part, we're going to try to understand something about the dynamics behind the multistability, and we're going to do it with conceptual models, so a bit more mathematical part. And then in the last part, we're going to have a brief look of what might happen by the end of the century using RCP scenarios. So the first thing that I want to answer today is then, can we detect alternative stable states today in the Boreal forest? And to answer this, we have to actually answer something else, which is how do you detect it, if you can detect it. Even though we normally say that you can have these transitions, and sometimes they call them abrupt shifts or rapid shifts, when it comes to a forest of this size, this is not something that happens from 1 year to the next, it can take up to centuries, hundreds of years or 1,000 years. So it's not so easy to detect it in the time of a research grant. But what we can do, and that what we often do, is that we trade time for space. So we aggregate over different portions of the globe, and we look at different places as if they were independent realizations of the same system. So if then we look at the spatial distribution of the forest, we can actually treat it as a time series of the tree cover. And then if you do that, the first hint about the multistable dynamic is that there are multiple modes. There are some preferential modes, preferential states in which you will find more often the system than not, and the states in between them, they're going to be less frequent. This has been done a few years back by Scheffer and colleagues in 2012. They looked at a global data set for tree cover fraction from the Modis product. They isolated the boreal forest, and they saw that there were 3 preferential states, 3 preferential modes that could correspond to different vegetation states. I'm going to call them the treeless or low vegetation, low tree cover state, with tree cover that ranges from 0 to 20%. Then there's an open woodland, which is basically a savanna analog for the boreal forest, that goes roughly to 40-45%. And then there is full forest that goes from 45% tree cover all the way up to 100, although 100% is not really found so often for the boreal case. Now the point is, do these modes, these states actually correspond to stable states, or they're just a product, for instance, of the driving factors, the driving environmental conditions behind it? It could be that they're just driven by precipitation. That could be the case, for instance, when comparing it to the Amazon, product of precipitation and a multimodality within the precipitation itself. To answer this, it's possible to take more products related to other environmental variables, so not just the tree cover. We did so. We took precipitation, we took temperature, we took spring moisture, we looked at the details of the soil, and then we compared these driving variables to the resulting tree cover fraction. And what you want to understand is whether fixing the environmental conditions, you can uniquely determine in which state the boreal forest is going to be. If it's going to be in the forest, it's going to be open woodland, or if it's going to be treeless or low tree cover. I will exemplify just with 2 variables the procedure. So we have here on the x-axis, we have the mean annual precipitation. On the y-axis, we have the mean minimum temperature. On the sides, you have the marginal distributions of these 2 variables, color-coded depending on which of the tree cover states you can find at any given point. And then what you see in the middle is actually the isolines of the distribution of the tree cover states in the phase space created by the 2 variables. And the important part is that there are overlaps in these isolines, in these distributions. So if you fix the conditions for temperature and for precipitation, you cannot uniquely determine where you're going to land in the states of the tree cover. You have multiple possibilities. If you do this for all the driving factors of the boreal forest, you can come up with this map. Now here in green is the monostable areas, or where you can uniquely determine the conditions in which the forest will be. Here, if you have a disturbance, such as wildfire, because the states are stable, the system should bounce back and recover back to its original state. In the purple areas, instead, the system is multistable. It can be found in different states, and it has a lower resilience. So if we push it with a disturbance of decent magnitude, it's not going to recover back to its original state, but it's going to transition to a different one among the 3 stable ones. This area covers roughly 1 million square kilometers, that is a quarter of Europe. And the point to notice is that this is not the total multi-stable area. It's just that where we can detect right now that the system stays in different states given the same driving environmental conditions. What I want you to take away from this first part is essentially this, that we can actually detect these areas, these multi-stable areas, in Earth observations, that they cover roughly the size of a quarter of Europe, and that in these areas there is a reduced resilience. So if we push the system with a disturbance, we can trigger ecosystem shifts because they're very close to tipping points. About this, probably Vasilis will say a bit more. So I'll not go more into it. Now, can we understand something of what is causing this phenomenon for the boreal forest? Because it's a bit different from the Amazon. There, it's very well known what is the main dynamic that is happening with precipitation, with disturbances. But here, water is not the only limiting factor, or is not the main limiting factor, which of course is temperature. And the picture is a bit different also for something else. So far, I treated and I presented you the boreal forest simply as an aggregate that is the tree cover fraction. So it's one entity that has different realization, which differ in magnitude, if you want. But of course, there are a lot of trees there, almost 1 trillion trees. And the peculiarity of them, with respect to the Amazon, is that they belong only to a handful of species compared to the thousands that aggregate in the Amazon forest. However, these different species, they have very high functional diversity, meaning that they developed, in the course of years, different survival adaptations, particularly to disturbances, and they act and look very differently. In the specifics, we have 3 main fire functional types, or plant functional types with different fire adaptations. So we have different plants that behave differently with respect to fire. On one hand, we have embracer trees. They sort of say like fires. They tend to promote it. They leave fuel on the ground. They have low branches that can easily catch fire. And they spend most of their energy into creating semi-serotinous cones that actually need the very high temperatures of fire to explode and release the seeds. So that's actually their strategy. They don't intend to necessarily survive a fire because they can spread their seeds and regrow from there. Opposite of this, we have the resistors, such as the larch, which is present in Siberia.
What does serotinous mean?
It's just for the composition of these cones. But it's basically, if you think of the pine nuts that you see, these are these cones. And they are such, this particular one, not all the ones of the conifers, they are such that they are gonna release but it's just for the composition. The resistors, as I was saying, they behave the opposite way. They try to survive fire, so they build thick protective bark, and they tend to suppress fire in the sense that they don't leave fuel, they don't have low branches, so even if a fire happens, it's going to be relegated to the lower part of the forest, and it's not going to affect the main trunk of the tree. Somewhere in the middle, we have avoiders. They don't have very specific strategy as these are the 2 types. They don't like fire, they get killed by fire, but what they do is that they try to live in places where fire are less probable. So wetter area and more shaded areas. There is a second peculiarity when it comes to the boreal forests and these functional types, and is their distribution. In fact, it's asymmetric within Eurasia and North America. The avoiders are present a little bit everywhere, But the embracers, the one that promote fire, are only present in North America. And the resistors, with a few exceptions, are only present in Eurasia and especially in Russia and Siberia. This, of course, has consequences, or it's caused by different fire regimes. So you have different fuels, you have different fires, and then you have different trees. Or you have different trees, then you have different fuels, and then you have different fires. So it's not clear what caused this asymmetry. If it's a product of the different fire regimes in the different continents, yes?
So there is no human effect, like these species are native, have always been there, or?
Always, I don't know, but these species are native from there, yes. It's one hypothesis is actually that the difference is due to the way that the glaciers retracted. But yes, this is not human influenced. Yes, so looking at this particular distribution, because if you look at then at the environmental conditions, if you look at the temperature, if you look at the soil moisture, they're fairly similar in these two areas. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar. So then we actually thought, is it possible that the multistability itself and the main dynamic of the boreal forest is driven by the competition between these different plant functional types? And we tried to evaluate this. We built a simple conceptual model. It's based on ecological competition, so Lotka-Volterra style equations, similar to the ones that Joost showed at the beginning of the day, but simpler, let me say it. In these equations, the growth of each plant functional type depend on the temperature, and the amount of any given plant functional type, of any given tree species that can populate one area is determined by the carrying capacity, which depends on the rest of the environmental conditions that we used for the first part of the talk. So there's going to be precipitation, there's going to be the presence of permafrost, there's going to be soil moisture. And then, on top of this deterministic dynamic, we added two stochastic terms that are going to affect, one, the general dynamic, and this is the wildfires. So that's just a stochastic event that can create fluctuations in the different populations. And then we have stochastic nutrient availability that actually affect the carrying capacity of each population. And then what we did is that we calibrated the coefficient of the model based on observations. And then we ran the model outside of the calibration area specifically in the purple areas that I showed at the beginning, the area where we cannot uniquely determine what is going to be the state of the forest, so where we suspect there is multistability. And this is what we get. This is for the entire boreal forest, so it's a bit coarse image, and we're going to look a little bit more into the details. But what we see is that also with the model, we can get different modes or preferential states. As I said, the model behaves quite differently in the different areas, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. This is Eurasia, so just the eastern part of the initial plot. And this is, again, the same multistable areas that I showed at the beginning, just color-coded for the type of tree cover states that you can find. So we're going to have the green areas, that is where you can have transitions between forest and open woodland. And the blue shaded ones are where you have transitions between the low tree cover and the open woodland. And here I isolated three areas which are quite fitting to exemplify the behavior of the model. We have the first one, which is sort of central, where you have all the possible transitions. You have forest, open woodland, and open woodland treeless. Then there is the second area, which is the southern easternmost area. And here you have only transitions between open woodland and forest. And as you move north with more permafrost, you pass to the third area where we have only transitions between treeless and open woodland. And if we then run the model in these areas and we look at the final tree cover fraction as a sum of all the different plant functional types, in all the different areas, this is what we get. The first area is on the left, and the other two are on the right, going northward, same as in the map. And what we can see essentially is that we get the peaks more or less where we would expect them from observations. So we have 3 peaks more or less when it comes to the first area, so all possible states, the treeless or low tree cover in this case, the open woodland and the forest state, and in the other 2 cases we only get low tree cover and open woodland, or open woodland and forest state. There is a bit of bias towards the 0 because that's a very big sink in the model. So if a population gets to 0, actually it cannot bounce back because we did not include stochastic reseedling of the areas. So once the population dies, it's dead forever. So this is a bit of bias for this 0 bar that is present in all the plots. So when it comes to the different states, the model actually works pretty well at predicting them in the different multistable areas, but it actually can do a bit more. If we look at the development of the different populations during the simulations, this is what we have here. On the x-axis now is time steps, or time. I mean, this is non-dimensional, but it doesn't matter. And then you have the tree cover fraction, this time for the specific plant functional type in each of the 2 plots. The top one is for embracers, only in Eurasia, and the bottom one is for resistors, again, only in Eurasia. And then what you see on the right of the plot is actually the final distribution of tree cover for that plant functional type achieved after equilibrium is reached. And everything, of course, is color-coded depending on the final state that is attained. What you can see is that if you look at the population of embracers, the dynamic is such that no matter where you start, it pretty much always dies out. So there is a huge part of the population that simply dies, and then the final tree cover fraction is mostly 0 everywhere. On the other hand, if you look at the resistors, the picture is completely different. So they remain in the system, and they have their own different stable states. So with the model, we actually get the resistors are dominating in Eurasia compared to embracers. On the other hand, if we look at North America, the embracers are staying in the system, and they are actually dominating even more than resistors. And this is fairly interesting because the model is run with very similar conditions. It's the same conditions that we used in the first part, so these are taken from observations. And the only difference is actually that the permafrost distribution for North America is different than the one in Eurasia. So we actually speculated that the asymmetry in the different plant functional types could arise just when taking into account the permafrost adaptations together with the dynamic of the different plant functional types. This, of course, all of this depends not just on the model, but on the environmental conditions that we use to run it and that we also used in the observation phase. And these conditions are changing and are bound to change towards the end of the century. So can we say something with this same model about what is going to happen in the future? This question is a bit trickier to answer, let's say, because just with the model, of course, you cannot. You need some data to use as forcing to run the model. So the first thing that I did was actually to look at data set for the different scenarios. We looked at 2 different scenarios for this, the RCP 2.6, so low emissions, well, relatively low emissions, and the RCP 8.5 with higher emissions. And we took the last decade of the 21st century, and we looked at the usual environmental conditions taken from the CEB 5 ensemble from the Max Planck. The first thing that I did with this data was to try to see where are the conditions that cause today multistability. So the ones that we saw in the map so far, the purple ones at the beginning, where are these going to be in the future? So this is the present day condition. And this is what I get in the CEB 5 data. So the locations are fairly similar, purple for the RCP 2.6 and orange for the 8.5, only for the possibly multistable areas, or where there are the conditions that lead to multistability. And contrary to what I expected, the RCP 2.6 is the scenario that shows an increase in these areas, and the RCP 8.5 shows a decrease of the possible multistable areas. To say more about what is happening there, we actually updated the conceptual model so that it would include an effect of the higher concentrations of CO2. This is done by including a term in the growth factor of all the equations, and with a little bit of calibration again taken from the CEB 5 data. And then we run the model on this data. And what we see is that, yes, for the RCP 2.6, the model shows really multistable behavior. There are alternative states with mixed equilibria, but for the RCP 8.5, the multistability almost disappears. So it seems that in one case, multistability is still an option. You can have vegetation shifts between these different states, which seem to be more probable than at present day. But for the other case, this doesn't seem to be an option. However, this apparent stability comes at a cost, and the cost is the three species stability. Because what we see is that in North America, the resistors are actually outcompeting embracers, contrary to what happens with present-day conditions when we look at the RCP 8.5 simulations. So the idea is then that the vegetation shift can happen in both cases for the RCP 2.6 and the 8.5, but for different reasons. In one case, it's going to be transitions between different tree cover states. And in the second case, it's sort of a phenological bifurcation that leads to different states that have similar tree cover fraction, but different species. So or different plant functional types. So they're actually going to interact differently with the environment. This, of course, it's a bit simplistic because to change the dominant tree species, you need, first of all, to kill it, and then you need to have an invasion of seedlings, so it's not something that can just happen. But the results point at reduced resilience on the species level for North America. Just to summarize everything. Sorry.
Fire is in your model?
Yes, there is fire. It's stochastic, and it's the same both for as rates of occurrence is the same in the model both for North America and for Eurasia.
But it changes
with the different we didn't in the conceptual model we did not include the effect of climate on fire, so it's not coupled.
Okay, that was a question.
Yes, no, it's not coupled to the scenario, no. Just to summarize a bit, so the first part was related to detection. Can we detect? Yes, it seems that we can detect areas of multistability also for the boreal forest, not just for the Amazons, although the dynamic is a bit different. And this is what I showed or tried to show in the second part. Looking at the competition between the different plant functional types that populate the boreal forest, and showing actually that not only the multistable dynamic of the boreal forest can emerge through this competition, but also the asymmetry that we see in Eurasia and North America in their distribution. And finally, when looking at the future, we can still have vegetation shift no matter the scenario, but for different reasons. In one case, the RCP 2.6 is because the stable conditions where the tree cover fraction is uniquely determined by the environmental conditions are decreasing, so the area of the multistable ones is increasing. And in the case of the RCP 8.5 is because we have a decrease of the resilience of the different tree species composing North America with respect to the one composing Eurasia. And just as a note, there is a small percentage of resistors in North America. It's not completely embracers, but as it was in a previous slide, it's like 0.5% compared to 70% of the embracers. So it's almost nothing, but they are already there, so they could expand from there. And that was it. Thank you, and of course I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. Questions from Martin?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Beniamino. That's very nice. I have a follow-up question to Michael's. Do you prescribe fire, or is there any interaction between fire and vegetation? Because usual, I mean, if you're not, no.
So
vegetation affects fire.
The probability of a fire happening is prescribed. We can change it, and we did change it in different simulations to see what effect that has on the dynamic. And what changes in the different plant functional types is then how much damage is taken from a given fire of a given magnitude. So if there are resistors, they're going to take less damage, and if there are embracers, the population is going to decrease more to bounce back afterwards.
Okay, so that's, but I mean, for fire you need fuel, and some fuel is better than the other. So that basically you're assuming that the three different tree types provide the same type of fuel. So
there is one more term that is basically, so it's sort of like that. It's like what we're saying is that the ignition probability is the same. And then there is the amount of damage that the fire does to the tree cover, but there is also the magnitude of the fire. The magnitude of the fire is different for the different plant functional types, and at the same magnitude, different plant functional types take different damage. So that's the way we implement it. Yes?
Thank you. So you have done this analysis forcing with CMIP5 data. So I think it would be interesting to see now for CMIP6 if any of the current Earth system models actually are including such functional types for the Arctic. And also then the question, since you described this impact of permafrost representation, also to what extent they represent those
For
actors.
sure. That was actually one of the points that I made when I did this work was exactly that, because at that stage, none of this was inside the model.
Exactly.
And the result from this was we should take care of it.
So this
just
is
to
really
check
suggesting that one should give a look at that. Yeah.
Beniamino? Okay. No, sir. Okay, I go. No, please go. You can go first. Okay, all right. So, Beniamino, thank you very much for the talk. So you said that permafrost has an effect on the distribution of the different species, right? So if you take your model and use data from an Earth system model that has no permafrost included, or does that have an effect on your model? So if you use the forcing data from RCPs, which do not include permafrost.
Yeah, so that's a good question. What we did, because we wanted to have this, the same way as the initial data set that we use for permafrost, this is actually a semi-observational data set, which is based partly on empirical observation and partly on remote observations. And what they did is that in the original data sets, they basically wrote an equation, a law that links the temperature of the surface with the temperature of the air to the soil conditions, and then given that, it produces an estimate of the probability of finding permafrost. So what we did for the projections was to do the same with the CMIP5 data, in which we had the basic elements. So we just had to reproduce the calculations, and then we could use that for the projections.
Okay, thank you.
Because otherwise, it would not work.
And would you expect that if you take the forcing data from an Earth system model that included permafrost, that it would somehow influence your data?
That could be,
Your
because
results?
a drawback of this is that, let's say, the permafrost dataset is not so finely resolved, which in this case, it doesn't matter so much because it's a, let's say, simple conceptual model. But if you would do things with a higher level of sophistication, then it would definitely have an impact.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, this is maybe a question to sort of everybody in this session. These models are still what in the early days, I think, of Earth system modeling was called green slime. I mean, you just smear it out, and so there are no individual trees.
Yes.
The reason I'm asking is because you have multiple types of trees, and well, I once did a study on a somewhat different problem, which is called the wildland-urban interface. So you have trees that are standing, those that are burned, and then you have houses. So instead of having percolation as you have in so-called forest fire models, I also remember the famous saying that the forest fire model is not a model of forest fires. But, you know, it's an Ising model sort of thing. But if you have more types, there's no more percolation, there's smooth surfaces and so on. So it does matter. I'm just wondering whether you or anybody sort of in this room has been trying to do agent-based model type studies, not green slime type studies, and whether you found some difference.
Yeah, for forests there are, yes. The problem is that being agent-based, they require massive computation. And then if you want to do the entire boreal forest for...
No, I'm not thinking of your
it's a
redoing what
problem.
you've been describing
but
to us, but you know, taking some sort of area more or less idealized and looking at the different possible configurations between your embraces, resistors, and...
there was something similar now I don't remember if it was agent-based or GAP model, but in that direction. I think it was 2 years ago at AGU, there was a poster. I don't remember exactly the name of the author of the poster. It was in that direction. And what turns out from that was that a very important role, together with these aspects, was also the range of influence that you can have for the seedlings and for the seeds to expand. So that they came out that was also quite important into determining these dynamics. So if it's really just localized, or if they can be transported to quite some distance. And then, of course, on the conditions that they found where they land. But
well, I guess the conclusion of this paper in the PNAS was that you should have your whole community fireproof the houses, because if they don't, then the fact that you do doesn't matter.
We continue with the question here.
Yeah. What is the mechanism through which permafrost is affecting your distribution?
So in the conceptual model, it's very simple because it affects the carrying capacity of any given area. So the more permafrost, well, it's not necessarily linear, but let's say the permafrost has an effect on how many trees of any given plant you can have in that area. Effectively, what it does is that it influences the soil moisture that is available in the growing season, because it's thawing slowly, releases basically a constant flux of soil moisture. But on the other hand, it can also prevent water absorption if, for instance, the roots of a tree are still encased in permafrost or in ice, and the outside temperature is high enough so that the tree wants to take up water and cannot. And I translated this into affecting basically if you can have more trees or not. But it's a bit simplistic when it comes to that dynamic.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is, I guess your resistors are mostly your lyrics, or not?
Yes, it's mostly lyrics. There are some
which have a
kinds.
completely different leaf habit,
Yes.
and also all kinds of other adaptations compared to kind of
Yes.
fire is one of them, but indeed there are many other theories why lyrics would be dominating that side.
Yes.
So, do you think you might predict the right behavior for the wrong reasons, because lyrics is adapting to other processes as well?
Lyrics is for sure adapted to other processes as well, this is true, but lyrics is not the only resistor, and that is why this is still interesting. And there are some pines which are actually resistors, and there are some pines in the US, or like in Canada, that are resistors as well, and they show a behavior, or they have a phenology that is more similar to the ones of spruce, for instance, than what is the Siberian larix. So they have quite different habitats and quite different general adaptations, but when it comes to fire, they behave the same as in the larix. But it's true that for sure the fact that the larix is adapted to many more conditions than just fire is probably one of the main reasons why it's so dominant in Siberia and generally in Eurasia.
Hi, thanks for your presentation, very nice. I have a bit technical question maybe. So there was a few years ago, there were discussions about these modus data,
Yes.
if you could use that for this bistability analysis because of this card algorithm also.
Yes.
That it was in a way almost, well, that the reflection and then there's kind of non-linearity in the algorithm that you find anyhow a bistability in there, or bimodality. And my question is that currently solved, or is that still an issue, or do you know something about that?
Okay, so multiple answers. So one is that in doing this, because actually that paper came out exactly when we were doing it, so we actually looked also at the use of other satellite data for the tree cover, and then the result doesn't actually change so much. And one of the reasons is that that issue arises in particular when looking at the very high resolution of the data set, so 250 meters, 500 meters, and at the lower range of tree cover. That is where the phenomenon happens the most. And for doing this, we actually aggregated to lower resolution, and then these smaller discontinuities sort of disappear, because you're looking basically at 5 or 50 kilometers instead of just 200. But at that stage, this was not resolved yet.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I suggest we move forward. So to the next talk will be given by Vasilis Dakas. And thank you, Beniamino, again.